Good day, my name is Sankit and together with Nada, we will be presenting this paper about enriching API documentation with code samples and usage scenarios from crowd knowledge. We will be covering the following topics over the course of our presentation. Let us start with some background required for this paper. API documentation is a collection of documents containing information about the classes and modules of a library or framework, such as this example here, which shows a part of the API documentation for the ArrayList class in Java. Stack Overflow is a popular question and answer site where users can ask questions related to programming. These questions are answered by more experienced developers or users and also can be scored by other users. As we can see in the image here, there are certain common parts of a question and answer such as question title, related tags, user score, accepted answer, and code samples present in each question and answer post. Let us move on to the motivation for this research paper. The authors of this paper saw that there was a severe scarcity of code samples in API documentation. For example, we can see on the tables on the right that only 11.4% of Java APIs and 6.3% of Android APIs are provided with code samples. They also noticed that the go-to place for discussions and doubts regarding programming was Stack Overflow. So the authors of this paper asked the following questions. 1. Can we make API documentation better by adding well-described code samples to it? And 2. Where can we get these code samples and their descriptions from? They then researched about whether anyone had done something like this before. The authors credit the example-oriented API document or the EXODocs approach as being a seminal development which answers almost all of their research questions. EXODocs is an intelligent code example recommendation system. It uses the Coder's code search engine to get API usage examples and processes the results to add code snippets to the relevant API. Zhang and his teammates identified two areas of improvement over the EXODocs approach. 1. The quality of examples selected, and 2. The need for descriptions of each of these code snippets. This is where they add their contributions. The contributions were in the form of a new framework called the API Document Enriching using Crowd Knowledge approach, or the ADECK approach. It offered to embed code examples into API documentation, just like EXODocs, but scraped and processed them from Stack Overflow, a trusted site. It also added the novel feature of adding usage scenarios or descriptions to each of these scraped examples. Here we see the structure of the ADECK framework. It takes as input the API documentation in a document format and the database dumps from Stack Overflow. Each of these modules are addressed in the succeeding slides. First is the API type extractor, which identifies and extracts API types such as classes and interfaces from API documentation. Here we see the Java API documentation listing classes and interfaces on the left and the web page for the stack class on the right. These can be downloaded as HTML files and parsed. It then passes the collected class and interface names to the question and answer search and preprocessing engines. This module passes the Stack Overflow database dump files to generate question and answer pairs. These pairs are filtered based on tags and other conditions. They are then combined with the input of the API extractor and checked against some heuristic rules to link the question answer pairs to the API names. It then uses keyword matching and regular expressions to extract usage scenarios from the question and code samples from the answers. These usage scenario and code sample pairs or tuples are then passed to the clustering and representation modules. This module implements clustering based on a complex similarity measure. This similarity measure consists of computing the three paths listed over here. Among these three, the lexical similarity measures are calculated as cosine similarities of the usage scenario and the code sample respectively. The code sample structural similarity, CSS, is a measure calculated using the least common subsequence between code samples of two given tuples. Clustering is implemented using a technique called affinity propagation clustering. The clusters are ranked by size and the top 10 clusters are selected. From these top 10 clusters, the tuples are ranked by user score, and the highest scored tuple from each cluster is passed on to the next module. Finally, the top ranked code samples along with the user scenarios are passed to the information embedding module, where they are inserted into the document or page of the API class or method. In the image on the right, we can see the user scenario and its code sample inserted below the description of the ADECK class. In the case presented in the paper, the documentation was in the HTML format, hence one additional paragraph tag was enough to insert the user scenario and code sample tuple into the documentation. The final implementation of the ADECK tool looked like this. Note the section titled Commonly Used Usage Scenarios with their corresponding code samples highlighted in red, where we can see the top 3 tuples inserted as usage scenarios with their explanations and code samples.
Hi, I'm Nada. Moving to the experiments and the results of the study. 4 questions lead this experiment. The first research question is used to count the number of API types that are enriched with code samples and usage scenarios. This is applied on 3 different documentation, which are Raw API, Exodocs API, and ADECK API. Also, for this research question, the true positive rates are calculated. What is the true positive API? If API type and code sample are consistent, API is just as positive rate. Otherwise, it is treated as false positive rate. In the table, we can see that the positive rate of ADECK API is higher than the positive rate of the other APIs. Moving to the second question. By this question, they try to investigate the quality of ADECK, whether it is higher than Exodocs or not. To evaluate that, the 10 most commonly used API types and different programming tasks is selected, as shown in this table. The subject of this evaluation is the undergraduate students who are outstanding in Java and Android programming. These students are required to answer questions regarding the conciseness, correctness, and usability. The result of this evaluation, as we can see in this figure, is that the ADECK API, which is the red triangle in this figure, achieves higher quality than Exodocs, which is the blue triangle, in terms of conciseness, correctness, and usability. For example, for the correctness criteria, the average scores of the code samples in ADECK enriched Java doc is 4.26 and an Android doc is 3.9. They set up the third question to investigate whether there is consistency between the code sample and their usage scenarios in ADECK API. To evaluate that, the entire user scenario and code sample for the selected API types are assigned to the volunteers to score the consistency levels. They found that the code sample is consistent with the user scenarios, as we can see in this histogram. The x-axis describes the Likert scale scores from 1 to 5. As we notice, the range from 3.5 to 4 is the highest. Based on that, they conclude with this: the code samples are relatively consistent with the user scenarios in ADECK API. By the fourth question, they investigate whether the ADECK enriched API documentation is helpful for developers to resolve programming tasks or not. To measure that, 21 developers are recruited to participate in the experiment. After that, group of API types are selected, then 3 unambiguous programming tasks are designed with different topics and different difficulty levels. They conclude this experiment with that using the ADECK enriched API documentation, developers can complete more tasks with less time than using the other API documentation, as we see in the figure. Moving to threats to validity. In terms of the internal validity, in research question 1, true positive APIs are manually evaluated. However, they mitigate that by recruiting 8 volunteers to evaluate the quality of code samples and the consistency levels. Also, the re-implementation of exodocs may be not exactly the same as the original. However, code review process is applied to ensure the implementation quality. Finally, the selection of the tasks may be one of the threats. However, they will employ more tasks in the future to evaluate ADECK API. In terms of the external validity, if no question and answer pair in Stack Overflow discusses a certain API, it would be impossible for ADECK to extract code samples with user scenarios for it. Also, the generalization of ADECK may be an external threat because they verify ADECK on Java and Android APIs without testing other API documentation. In conclusion, ADECK performs better than Exodocs in enriching API documentation with high-quality code samples and their user scenarios. Two assumptions in this study can be raised as questions for future research. The first assumption is that comparison has happened with an alternative implementation of Exodocs, not the original implementation. The second assumption is that testing is applied on mature discussed APIs such as Java and Android. Finally, we have some points for our perspectives. The first point, we think that there can be alternative metrics other than user score to ensure quality, such as answer's reputation. The second point, that usability is used to evaluate the quality of the code sample. We think this is subjective criteria. The third point, the relativity of the user score was not addressed. For example, is 63 good or 500 good? This could be developed as an additional metric. If score greater than X, then link this question answer pair to the API. Thank you. Please let us know if you have any question.